Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's get week 29 underway with another Mailbag Monday. Now, Lori H. in Wisconsin writes in with a question I wished I'd had the time to cover at Halloween because, well, it sure is spooky enough. Her question is simple. Just who or what are the Mewlips? Now, she says she loves all of Tolkien's poetry, but admits that this short little haunting one sticks in my mind. It's quite dark and scary, to me anyway. You're not alone in that. Is this just a little poem in and of itself? Or is it meant to be a place in Middle-earth? Maybe one of those stories told by the fireside to scare little hobbits. This is a terrifying question, Lori. Thanks a lot. Now, for those who don't know, the Mewlips are creatures that show up in a poem called The Mewlips, that is the 9th poem in the collection, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. Now, since Tolkien explains in the preface to that volume that the works are mainly concerned with legends and jests of the Shire at the end of the Third Age that appear to have been made by hobbits, especially by Bilbo and his friends or their immediate descendants, well, these are at least tangential to Middle-earth. Now, it's really hard to say that these are part of the legendarium precisely, but they're certainly connected. Anyway, let's start with the poem itself. Now, we can't read the whole thing, but we can have a guest read a good portion of it.
Over the Murloc mountains a long and weary way, in a mouldy valley where the trees are grey, by a dark pool's borders without wind or tide, moonless and sunless, the Mewlips hide. The cellars where the Mewlips sit are deep and dank and cold, with single sickly candle lit, and there they count their gold. Their walls are wet, their ceilings drip, their feet upon the floor go softly with a squish, flap, flip, as they sidle to the door. They peep out slyly, through a crack their feeling fingers creep, and when they've finished, in a sack your bones they take to keep. Beyond the Murloc mountains, a long and lonely road, through the spider shadows and the marsh of toad, and through the wood of hanging trees and the gallows weed, you go to find the Mewlips, and the Mewlips feed.
The Mewlips sound like charming people, really. Maybe a bit misunderstood. Certainly living off the grid. But what do we know about them? Well, Robert Foster, in his Complete Guide to Middle-earth, suggests that there may be echoes in the poem of the Misty Mountains, the Murloc Mountains, Mirkwood, with the spider shadows and wood of hanging trees and the gallows weed, and the long marshes. He also adds that the Mewlips could possibly be based, quote, on vague rumors of orcs. Now, no disrespect meant to Mr. Foster, whose guide I often find very helpful indeed, but I'm not going to be satisfied with that, and neither will you. So, let's dig deeper. Now, the first thing I thought of was to look at what Tolkien himself said about it, perhaps in the preface to the volume that I quoted from earlier. Well, guess what? It turns out that he mentions each and every poem at least once in the preface. For example, saying that in the Red Book it is said that number 5 was made by Bilbo and number 7 by Sam Gamgee. Oh, each and every poem, that is, except this one. So no information there. Thanks a lot. Now, I've got 3 books from Tom Shippey. No mention of Mewlips. 4 books from Verlin Flieger. No mention of Mewlips. 2 books from John Garth. Wait a minute, we have a mention. In the worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, Garth speaks about the dead marshes and then references an older version of the poem. Oh, wait, an older version, you say? Well, in the 2014 publication of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, editors Christina Scull and Wayne Hammond explain that this precursor was first published in the Oxford magazine in 1937. It was titled Knocking on the Door, Lines Induced by Sensations When Waiting for an Answer at the Door of an Exalted Academic Person. They say that he apparently wrote it initially in 1927, revising it before it was published a decade later, and he published it under the pseudonym Oxymore. Now, Scull and Hammond also tells us that that lengthy subtitle wasn't in the initial manuscript, only in a heavily amended typescript, both kindly supplied to us, Scull and Hammond say, by Christopher Tolkien. Apparently, the professor crossed it out, then restored it as though he could not decide if the poem was to be seen as a satire on university life. Now, that original version from 1937 has some differences, and that's where we're going to go back to Garth's work. The second stanza, which is not in the part that I shared earlier, so you'll need to look it up if you'd like to see the final version, originally read, "You sink into the bog who dare to knock upon their door, while fireworks flicker in the air and shine upon the shore." Well, now that certainly recalls scenes from Tolkien's experience on the Somme in World War I. As Garth says, the landscape of this fantasia on fear is like nowhere on earth except the Western Front at night, with its drowning mud, its bursts of artillery fire and flares. Garth goes on to point out that the rather Gollum-like Mewlips are also reminiscent of a trench rumor that no man's land after the battle was peopled, as another writer said, with wild men, deserters who lived there underground like ghouls among the moldering dead, and who came out at night to plunder and to kill. That's disturbing. Now, Hammond and Skull, not in their edition of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, but in the Companion and Guide, which itself is not to be confused with the Lord of the Rings Reader's Companion, explained that knocking on the door seems to be a comment on the trepidation of a student calling on a professor. Transformed into the Mewlips and divorced from its original meaning, it is a work purely of mood and imagination. Sure, creepy mood, I'd add, but yeah. Now, let's go back to Skull and Hammond's 2014 edition of Adventures. There they reveal the contents of a letter that's not in Carpenter's volume, not even the new expanded one. In 1963, Tolkien was responding to someone who had asked about the Mewlips, and he explained, according to Skull and Hammond, they were merely legend to hobbits. Nor would hobbits' minds dwell only on comforts, implying, it seems, that from time to time they would turn to the macabre, to the likes of grinning gargoyles and noisome waters, in the way that fairy stories by the Grimms or Andrew Lang, unexpurgated, can be, or are thought by some to be, the stuff of nightmares. Now, Tolkien doesn't explain the name itself, and none of the places in the poem can really be clearly and directly mapped to anywhere in Middle-earth. The Murloc Mountains, Marsh of Toad, okay, maybe you can think of some places, but every place has multiple places it could be mapped to. Now, sure, the Spider Shadows could be some reference to Mirkwood, but it could also be a reference to Nandungortheb, where Ungoliant dwelt in Beleriand. The willow trees in the river strand could be the Old Forests, or maybe Mirkwood, or something near the Sirion in the First Age. The grinning gargoyles make me think of the Watchers, while the noisome waters make me think of the dreadful Morgul Valley. So I don't think we can say, oh, the Mewlips must have lived here, or the Mewlips must have lived there. Now, as for some of the individual words, Gorcrows, which is a single word in the poem, is another word for carrion crows. Now, Skull and Hammond couldn't find gallows weed anywhere, but suggests that Tolkien may have meant it as a variation on gallow grass, or hemp, used to make ropes for hanging by a gallows. And folks, that is about it for the Mewlips. My advice is to stay away, and if you do find yourself in their neighborhood, for goodness sake, please don't knock on their door. Folks, that wraps it up for Mailbag Monday. If you have a less spooky question you'd like me to answer, please email it to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Let him know it's for today's Tolkien Times, and I'll get to it as soon as possible, with priority going to supporters of the show on Patreon. Speaking of which, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to find out how you can help the show, get an ad-free feed, listen to a bonus episode every single week, and a whole lot more. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, you know the drill. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. On podcast apps, be sure to follow or subscribe, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.